this pandemic, we're going to go ahead and get started. I expect the audience here in the room to be a little fluid throughout the afternoon, but we'll also have really strong engagement from our online audience. And so I just want to welcome all of you tuning in on Zoom, both yesterday and today. We really appreciate your involvement. Over the past day, we've heard from some of the nation's leading experts on redistricting, helping us better understand why it matters so much for American democracy and for us as citizens. This morning, we heard from several pioneering mathematicians about the latest analytical tools for measuring gerrymandering. And we got trained by some of our state's leading investigative reporters and redistricting consultants on how to be better redistricting watchdogs once the General Assembly actually sits down to begin drawing maps in the next couple of weeks. But looming over all of these discussions has been the fact of our location here in North Carolina, a state that's been at the epicenter of the redistricting debate for decades, but also a state where the current redistricting process will have profound implications, not just for politics here in North Carolina, but for the direction of our nation, perhaps, over the next decade. So this afternoon, we're focusing on the Tar Heel State, beginning with our lunch conversation. That's what my notes say, although we can't serve you lunch, unfortunately. Between Tom Ross and our post that we just heard, two leaders who probably agree on nothing other than the need for a fair redistricting process. And in this session, we're going to pick up where they left off with examining the state of play in North Carolina at this very moment, as we conclude the public hearing process this week and look ahead to the actual drawing of our congressional and state legislative maps in October. With us to set the scene are three panelists who have been observers in the redistricting process and also participants in it as advocates, attorneys, expert witnesses, and organizers. I'll just go from right to left, my right to left here, stage right to left. Starting with Chris Cooper, who is the Robert Lee Madison Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Public Affairs, and the Director of the Public Policy Institute at Western Carolina University. He writes for both academic and popular outlets and is frequently quoted in local, state, and national media about elections, North Carolina politics, state politics, and Southern politics. He was an expert witness in the Common Cause v. Lewis case that produced our current state legislative maps. And he has been called, quote, obsessive about North Carolina politics, but in a good way, on the New Yorker radio hour. Professor Cooper, thank you for being with us here today. To my left, John Hood is president of the John William Pope Foundation and a founder, past president, and current board member of the John Locke Foundation. He appears regularly in state and national media, including through the syndicated column that he's been writing since 1986, which appears in as many as 60 or more local newspapers around the state of North Carolina. While the border of his diploma is a lighter shade of blue, just mine, here at this university, he serves as co-chair of the North Carolina Leadership Forum, which is a bipartisan group of some of our state's top leaders that works to address some of the most pressing challenges we face, and as an adjunct faculty member here at the Sanford School. And he is also a board member of North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform. Finally, Caroline Mackey is a partner at Pointer Spruill, LLP, a North Carolina-based law firm, where she concentrates on her practice on complex commercial and governmental litigation. Caroline has served as counsel in several cases involving legislative and congressional redistricting plans, including racial and partisan gerrymandering legislation. She is currently advising local governments tasked with redistricting their own electoral districts, something you heard a little bit from Tom Ross talk about. And Caroline, we really appreciate you being here. I want to acknowledge we are supposed to be joined today by Professor Jarvis Hall of North Carolina Central University. Unfortunately, Dr. Hall has had something come up that prevented him from being here at the last minute. So I just want to acknowledge that he was supposed to be here, and also that in his absence, our conversation will be incomplete. And as somebody who has worked very hard to ensure that communities of color are represented in this redistricting process. And so we regret that he's not here, yet we are so very excited about the three panelists we do have. So our session will proceed as follows. First, I'll ask a few questions to get the conversation started. When there are about 30 minutes left in our session, we'll begin fielding questions from the audience, rotating between our live and virtual audience. And then, as before, we'll have faculty member fielding questions from the virtual audience. So if you're tuning in online, please use the Q&A function to pose your questions, and we will field them for you. And so when Professor Hirschlag asks questions, he's not just hiding the microphone, he's actually repeating them from our online audience. And then finally, we hope all of our audience, in person and online, will engage with our panelists and help promote the conference to their personal or organizational social media accounts using the hashtag RAD21, that's RAD21. And this session is being recorded and will also be posted later on Paulus's YouTube channel. All right, deep breath there. With that, we'll turn to our discussion, and I'd like to start with Professor Cooper, just asking you to set the scene for us briefly. Where is the North Carolina General Assembly right now in this process? When do we expect it to conclude? And briefly, what changes, good or bad in your view, have we seen in the process relative to previous times? And I'm going to share my microphone with Chris just to make sure that you're all here.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for asking me here. I'm glad to be part of the conversation. As far as where we are in North Carolina, I like to think of this sort of like we're about to enter the intermission. Act 1's about to be over. But this is not one of those long intermissions where you should like go out, go to the restroom, get some phone calls, grab a drink. Like you need to be back pretty soon. I think that we're going to conclude the public hearings later on this week. I think we got Fayetteville and Wilmington left, if I remember correctly. And then we'll get to drawing, right? We've already set the basic parameters, right? They've agreed on these. Some of these are relatively non-controversial, right? The sort of standard redistricting criteria that we read about from one state to the next. A couple of things that I think that are notable. They're not wide deviations. They're not unheard of or crazy or something, but they did say that we're not going to use partisan data, which I think everybody in the room would probably agree is a good thing. I think my guess is that agree to which people think this guarantees or ensures a fair process probably varies in the room and in the virtual room, but I don't think anybody would argue that that's a bad thing. They have also decided not to use racial data. My guess is we would see some more disagreement in the room, the virtual room, and the room here about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. They've also decided that they can take into account incumbency. And I think that's, so it was listening to the last panel. Our code talked about his proposal from 2001, I believe. And if I remember correctly from that proposal, they actually wanted to get rid of incumbency protection from the original, from the Republican proposal previously. So I think that piece of it, certainly, Democrats did many of the same things when they were in charge, but I think that will continue to be a controversial provision. Just a couple more things in the beginning. I realize that the audience is from folks who draw maps for a living, folks who analyze maps for a living, it's people who are just starting to get interested in the process. So kind of maybe aim more at the latter group of people. North Carolina is a little bit weird, not just because we're basketball rivalries, but we're also weird because the governor of our state does not have veto power over redistricting. As far as congressional lines, I believe Connecticut is the only other state where that is true. And I think state legislative lines, I believe there are 4 other states where that's true: Connecticut, Maryland, South Carolina, and some state that I'm forgetting right now. But that is, I think, a really critical difference. What that means is that our General Assembly has a lot more control. Unless we think that this is some recent thing, the person, it turns out we have at least partially to blame for this, oddly enough. In 1995, the state of North Carolina was the last state in the country to give the governor the veto power. So we were, I think, about a century after the rest of the country. It's a pretty weird deal. So when the General Assembly debated various proposals to give the governor the veto power, the guy who wrote the bill, or this was the primary sponsor of the bill that became the law, said we shouldn't give the governor veto power over redistricting. Right? We want to give him veto power over other things. Well, the person who sponsored that bill was a legislator named Roy Cooper. So Roy Cooper drew up the bill that became the law that gave our governor veto power, but did not give the governor veto power over redistricting. And I think that makes our state one of the many ways in which our state, I think, is a little bit different than some others.
Thank you, Chris. And you inadvertently or not laid the groundwork pretty well for this question. Because I did want to ask John, you applauded the process and criteria adopted by the General Assembly, just as we did in 2019. In the last court order redistricting, and a lot of the current rules drew heavily on that process. Yet I'm sure you hear the same speculation I do, that the process still might produce maps that disproportionately favor the party in power. And we don't yet know how fair or unfair the map will be. But the question I want to pose to you, and this is one that was asked in the previous session, is this: what is the value of a fair process if it doesn't also include safeguards to ensure that the fairness of the end product?
Well, thank you for that question. And it cannot be answered until we think about what our goals are for redistricting reform, or perhaps a different way to, because that's sort of a negative. What do the public want from redistricting? That sounds like a simple question, but I don't think it is. For many people who are not political junkies, what really annoys them most about gerrymandering is the mandering part. It's the salamander. It's squiggly lines. They see a map that has lots of snakes, and they think it looks fishy, which is kind of mixing up my thoughts. The point is, they want to have confidence that if they live in this community or in that community, that they're going to be in the same district with the other people who live in that community, or maybe the same district that they were in before. They're looking for something that's not crazy and that is stable. Now, of course, most people also are in favor of competitiveness. We should have political districts where the outcome is not predetermined when you get past the primary, but there's actually going to be a general election contest. So they want rationality, let's say, they want competitiveness, and some also want, and this is different, some also want proportionality. That is to say, if you had a certain percentage, if you had 55% of the statewide vote for the state senate or Congress or something, they want to get most of the seats, but not a supermajority of the seats, because that would be disproportionate. When I first was interested in this issue, it was in 1991. I was doing a magazine article about the then controversies about race-based redistricting, including in North Carolina. And I talked to a professor at Northwestern, a law professor, who nevertheless gave me good information, which his name was Daniel Polsby. And he kind of convinced me. He and a colleague made up the Polsby-Popper standard for compactness, and there are other standards, but that was one of the first. And he basically argued to me at the time as a reporter covering the story that geography is not just our friend, it is an essential part of the story. That is to say, people want maps that are as much as possible a series of squares or a series of relative, not just contiguous, but relatively rational places that don't meander around everywhere. And that if you do that, it will also help to move us towards competitiveness and proportionality. But he pointed out to me at that moment, 1991, I hadn't really thought about this before. Competitiveness and proportionality can be competing values. So let's say you had a congressional map of 10 districts, and if you drew 4 very safe Republican seats, the incumbent is, or whoever gets the nomination is never going to lose, and 4 very safe Democratic seats, and then a couple of swing seats, you will probably get proportionality almost all the time, unless the maps are ridiculously drawn. But imagine that they were reasonably drawn. You have 2 competitive seats, and so that might be a good Democratic year, or it might be a good Republican year, it might be kind of a neither or, and so one goes to a D and one to an R or whatever. But whatever happens, you're not going to get huge swings, huge disparities between the total share of the vote statewide and how many seats one party or the other controls. That's proportionality. Of course, it's not competitive. There's only 2 seats that are really up for grabs. And frankly, in North Carolina, that would be stretching it because 1 is competitive, I think. But anyway, so that's a different matter. A different matter might be a competitive standard, where if you had 10 districts, you might have only 2 or 3 districts that are safe for one party, 2 or 3 districts safe for the other party. Then we have, let's say, 4 districts that are competitive, or 5 districts that are competitive. Well, that's more competitive. Voters have real choices in who runs, and the messages of the campaigns, and the quality of the candidates, and the sort of national or state trends will generate an outcome that is unpredictable, which for many people is attractive. However, you could also get, particularly in today's swing congressional cycles, you might very well get a wildly disproportionate outcome. If you had a series of districts, let's say 5 competitive districts, and the Republican candidate won each of those districts 51-49, you have all 5 seats, and your total is going to be way out of proportion to the statewide vote. So I think we have to think about what our goals are, and the fact that we can be actually for all 3 to some extent, but there are inherent trade-offs between them. And so as we look at North Carolina and its history in redistricting, I myself used to talk in proportionality terms all the time. I pointed out in the 2000 decade that the Democrats on several occasions got less than half of the vote statewide, but controlled the General Assembly. In fast forward 10 years, more left-leaning political analysts said basically the same thing about the Republicans, that they didn't, either they got roughly the same as the Democrats or even a little bit less, and they got a supermajority or majority of the seats. I think that is still a useful exercise to look at, but I'm more persuaded that we should prioritize reasonableness, rationality. What people actually want is, if I live in a certain county, then my district's going to be fairly stable. It's not going to change all the time. It's not going to be part of some snake district that meanders across the Piedmont. And I think we ought to take competitiveness seriously, even if that means inevitably there will be moments when the proportional results of seats does not fit the proportional results of the statewide vote. Just a quick note, and I promise I'll shut up. The problem with the statewide vote analysis is that it's sort of like arguing the popular vote for president. It's important, but it's not the rule. It's not how you elect a president. And at the statewide level, if you count up all the votes for D's and R's for the state Senate, let's say, do you include the seats where there was no major party opponent? Because if you do, you're going to jack up the vote total for the incumbent who wins. There's a Democrat seat, the Republican doesn't run, the Democratic candidate gets lots of votes, there's 0 for the Republican. You add that to the statewide vote, you're going to get a weird outcome. But if you exclude them, and there are a number of them, you're also going to get a weird outcome. So proportionality is, in my view, a standard that maybe was more useful years ago, but I'm actually persuaded by my reading and even by this morning's panel from our mathematician friends, that maybe what we need to be thinking about is looking for extreme outliers rather than trying to assume that proportionality as a standard can get us all the way to the end zone.
But I have a quick follow-up for you, John, because this actually came up a lot in our opening conference session yesterday, is this notion of relationship between changes in residential patterns and the shape of political districts. And it may have been the case in the past, in the 90s or earlier, that the population was more dispersed and more heterogeneous politically. But of course now there's much more self-sorting. And one thing David Washington in particular, one point he made on our panel, said it was much easier to gerrymander with districts that look like nice geometrical shapes. And so I acknowledge that a lot of people in the public may find circles and squares and rectangles, rational. But is that still a useful concept in terms of achieving those other goals you talk about, like competitiveness or something approaching proportionality?
It's a very important question because, as I said earlier, all 3 of those, and we can list some other standards, communities of interest that aren't geographic. There are all sorts of other standards. I don't particularly like that one. I think that's basically an invitation to gerrymander forever. But if you put all of these different standards together, they're going to trade off with each other. There's absolutely no question about it. Here's my gut check view. And admittedly, I'm writing a newspaper column that is read by lots of people who are somewhat interested in politics, but it's not their business, it's not their passion, and they have some interest in what happens, but it's not something they're thinking about every day. And if you try to convince them, hey, I know you used to live in, the whole county that you lived in was a district or part of a district. But we think what we're going to do now is we're going to cut your county into 4 pieces and attach them to pieces of other counties, because this will generate a more competitive map. They will not like it. They will be very angry about it. And if you are trying to build a public support for a political outcome that going in is going to be highly unpopular with people who are not political junkies, you should start over.
Thank you. Carol, I think earlier when I posed the first question to John, I characterized the process as fair, or at least fairer than before in North Carolina. I think there are plenty of people in here and online who would probably disagree with that statement. And so I just want to ask you, as you're watching from a legal perspective, as you're watching the redistricting process unfold, what are kind of the red flags you look for both procedurally and substantively when we think about fairness?
Sure, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. Thanks for having this conversation. Your question is about red flags in the process, and what I'd like to do to answer that is to talk about some red flags that we saw in the last decade and some things that the legislature did in the process that were questionable, that were evidence in some of the litigation. And one of those is public hearings that don't mean anything. We had public hearings back in 2011, and the person who drew the maps didn't attend any of the public hearings. He didn't read any of the transcripts of the public hearings. He didn't take any of the comments from them and incorporate it into the process. So it's great to get public input, but if the public input doesn't mean anything, then it doesn't mean anything. So that's certainly a red flag, is the appearance of public participation and whether that participation actually impacts the map drawing process. Other red flags, whether the, it's going to be streamed online, I hear. I don't know what that will look like. We know what it looked like in 2019, and that was certainly an improvement from previous redistrictings in which the map drawer drew the maps on a computer in a basement and nobody had any input except for individual legislators who went and sat down with them. None of that was open to the public. So being able for the public to be able to see what's happening is great, but what does that actually mean? I think the proof is in the pudding on that one. What else? What other red flags? The criteria, there are certain things that have been discussed already and mentioned. Those are just a couple of the things that I can think of that's happened in the last decade that were relevant in the litigation. And those were things that the courts looked at and said, this was not an open and fair process. And it didn't, to quote Jonathan Mattingly, didn't reflect the will of the people.
Good attribution there. I do want to ask a follow-up though, because of course over the last decade, the legal landscape has shifted considerably on this issue. Can you briefly remind our audience just how it shifted, and then as we look ahead to the current process and beyond, I'm not going to ask you to speculate about hypothetical litigation, but I would ask you to remind us, what does the future of redistricting claims look like in light of how the landscape has shifted, both here in North Carolina and nationally?
How much time do I have? Okay. We heard a little bit about the redistricting litigation pre-2010. So let me catch us up from 2010 to where we are right now. 2011, the new maps were put in place. They were challenged as racial gerrymanders. There were multiple lawsuits there, lawsuits actually in state and federal court challenging legislative and congressional districts. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled in the Harris case in I guess that decision came out in 2017, that the congressional plan was an unconstitutional racial gerrymander as to 2 districts. And the legislature had actually redrawn already at that point. The court also ruled in a case called Covington that the legislative plans were unconstitutional racial gerrymanders. So the legislature set about redrawing mid-decade, which ordinarily is not allowed except if a court orders that your plans are unconstitutional. And in 2016, the legislature redrew because of the racial gerrymandering case. And they said, okay, we're not going to use race, but we're going to preserve our partisan advantage in this case. And in the congressional plan, that was a 10-3 advantage. So they redrew it, preserving that advantage, came out right and said, this is what we're doing, direct evidence of what the intent was. But we also had this new development with this expert witness testimony and the power of math and the power of science to look behind that and say, okay, they said that this is what they were going to do. Did they really do it? And how much did they mean what they said? And it turns out they really did it and they really meant what they said. So we had the simulations to show these were extreme partisan gerrymanders, that they didn't use race, but they said they were going to use party, and they did. I think the legislature learned a little bit from that. So when they redrew the legislative districts in the years are such a blur, 2017, I believe, they did not say that they were going to use partisan advantage, but we still had the math, and actually the math or the processes had improved, and they had gotten faster and quicker and a little bit easier to put together the simulations. And the simulation showed, yes, these were extreme partisan gerrymanders, that it's not likely that partisan politics did not predominate in these plans. And so that's what the 3-judge panel in the Lewis case in the summer of 2019 decided. So that decision resulted in an order for the legislature to redraw and put in place these parameters that we've been talking about. Open and public, no use of partisan or election data, et cetera. As a previous panelist mentioned, that decision wasn't appealed, so it's not technically binding, but it's out there. And it was a decision under the state constitution. I skipped over a very important case in my recitation, and that's the Rucho decision that went to the US Supreme Court. So the congressional plan was challenged in the 2016 redraw was challenged and went up to the Supreme Court. And that's where the Supreme Court said that these claims are not justiciable under the federal constitution. And while that case was decided, the state case was pending. Very similar facts, very similar law, except all state claims. And the state court in that one, 3 state trial court judges in North Carolina said, yes, our state constitution forbids this. So that decision was not appealed. We don't have a state Supreme Court decision about the free elections clause in the North Carolina Constitution and how it applies to redistricting, but we do, it's out there. It's in everyone's mind, and it has made an impact on this redistricting process. So back to your original question of what does that mean?
Sure.
It likely means we won't see partisan gerrymandering claims filed in federal court. I think everybody agrees with that. We may see them filed in state court. I don't know what sort of race claims may be filed. I don't know what other sort of other claims that we haven't seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of uncertainty, it sounds like, for at least greater clarity, but only by virtue of the federal courts not being a venue for partisan claims. Sounds like, just on a technical note, that we're down from 2 useful mics to 1. This one's not picking up clearly in the online. So I'm going to push back into the discussion, but could I actually ask you to take that one out of the stand for his benefit? All right, hopefully this one will be clear. And Chris, I want to ask you first, just if you will add to Carolyn's analysis by talking about how the North Carolina Supreme Court factors into this story and the implications of that. And then I wanted to ask you, Carolyn also mentioned this question of whether the public hearing process has been adequate. I know you've been following that pretty closely, paying attention to what people are saying in those hearings. So I'm hoping you can give us some report about that as well.
Yeah, happy to. And my goal here will be to make sure that people don't regret when my mic worked. So that'll be the idea here. But I guess to start off with how the state Supreme Court factors in, right? I mean, I think this is key. So people often will ask why North Carolina? Why has North Carolina been the sort of centerpiece of so many of these litigation. And I think part of the reason is we're a battleground state, and people like to point at 2008 as the time where that became true, but people were talking about us as a battleground state, a purple state, a swing state, pick your specific way you want to describe it, back to about 1980. So this has been happening for a while, sort of increased over time, certainly in 2008. But I know a lot of folks remember a guy named John Edwards around here, and John Edwards was not picked from North Carolina by accident, right? I mean, the idea was that we're a state that could have swung. So we're one where some of the small movement that happens ahead of time with maps can make a difference, right? Like if you gerrymander Mississippi, it's just probably not going to matter that much, right? Or if you gerrymander California, perhaps it doesn't matter that much. It matters here. I think another reason why is that our state Supreme Court has been, at least lately, in the opposite party of the legislature. So you've got that, and you have a governor, again, with no veto power. So you have this kind of perfect petri dish of conditions that can lead to litigation, but that also mean that it really matters. I think it matters here in a way that it doesn't matter in every state. And for the second piece on the open hearings, right, there were, I think it was 63 hearings, remember right, 10 years ago. There were 13 hearings this time. I've seen a lot of people make a lot of that online, and I'll talk more about it in a second, but I do want to remind people when we say, wow, 63 is a lot more than 13, that's true. But I don't really recall the same people making the argument that last round of redistricting worked oh so well. So clearly these open hearings are important, but the raw number is not, it's not like you get more hearings and all of a sudden you have a fair map, right? I think we'd all agree that's not necessarily the case. So I've started to do a little bit of analysis of just kind of when I say analysis, I mean like counting of comments at some of these hearings that have happened throughout the state. I started with the one that was at Western Carolina University, my home campus, and just try to get a little better sense of what people are saying. And you do kind of go through and try to do some codes, and I'll try to make this better over time. But right now it looks like, the comment mentioned most often, the plurality of the time, is something about fairness. And I think John talked about some of the different ways fairness can be defined, and my fairness might not be your fairness and vice versa, but I think there is a call from the people to produce fair maps. Obviously, some folks were more specifically able to define that. I saw, from my perspective anyway, a surprisingly small number of people defining communities of interest in these. So that's one thing I thought I would see more, right? I thought I would see somebody say, okay, well, look, we already know you have to divide up Mecklenburg County, make sure that you keep this community separate from this community together with this other community. I didn't see quite as much of that. I saw a good bit of folks arguing not to split counties, not to split municipalities, things like that. There were, at every hearing that I've looked at thus far, a fair number, a small number, but a real number of people who kind of just said they have faith in the system. Now, oftentimes that would be introduced by the person saying they were chair of the local Republican Party, or, thinking that my home one, the one near my house was the chair of the 11th Congressional District Republicans, spoke out, and she said, basically, I kind of trust the Republican legislature to do what they should do. So we did have some of those voices represented as well. What I kind of hope we'll see, obviously, is some evidence that these words are taken into account, right? I think what we should all be watching out for is what is the flash to bang from finishing these hearings and starting to see draft maps, and how short is that intermission I referred to in the beginning. I do think there was some good content in some of these forums, and I certainly hope that they will be listened to regardless of kind of which side ends up drawing the process.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm on board that the issue might be my mask and more so than the microphone. So I'm going to try my best here. Apologies to the online audience if you have trouble hearing me. I'm going to ask one question, and I'll pass that one over. I'll ask one question that I actually want to pose to all of you, and then we're going to start working in some questions from our audience, both in person and online. So if you are online and have not submitted through the Q&A function, please go ahead and do that. And I guess my question is that at a moment like this, it is awfully hard to look beyond the current process and this question of what the map looks like, and to wish for a different one. And I'm certainly not naive about the chances that North Carolina will adopt any kind of sweeping reforms anytime soon. But drawing on our last discussion, as we look back at the history of bipartisan support for reform, and the fact that it came a lot closer than a lot of people realized in the last decade, and also looking ahead at what could very well be another decade of litigation and uncertainty for voters, it's hard not to wish it weren't so. And so I'd like to start by asking John, and then I'll ask the others to respond too. What is the path forward for redistricting reform? What should that reform look like? And does bipartisan support still exist?
So the only certainty here, in my view, is that the current maps about to be drawn are about to be litigated. So there will be litigation. There's zero chance there won't be litigation. And we will probably have litigation of North Carolina's maps, if not all the states' maps, in perpetuity. We just need to understand that that's going to happen every single cycle in a competitive state, in a state where the parties sort of think that it matters, as Chris was getting at earlier. We did get surprisingly close to a legislative bill passing the House and maybe the Senate in the last session that would have authorized a constitutional referendum, which I think the voters would have voted for. And I think that we would have had a significant improvement in redistricting if that had happened. Not to rehearse the previous conversation too much, I'll just say real quick, there are three things that went wrong at the last minute. One of them wasn't at the last minute. This was a dispute among people who agreed about redistricting reform, but disagreed about tactics. I've worked for years with redistricting reformers on both sides of the aisle, and we worked together. We continue to be friends, but they chose a litigation strategy, which I completely understand, and in fact, it produced some benefits. But one of the drawbacks that was easily foreseeable and that actually occurred is that once you're in litigation, then the party in power doesn't want to make any changes in the rules, or at least that's what they just didn't want to talk about it until after the litigation was over. They didn't want to say anything or do anything that could be part of the evidentiary record in a litigation. So by going with litigation, we made it harder, not impossible, for legislation to pass. Second thing that went wrong was, as was said by Tom Ross, the chairman of the organization North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform, for which I'm a board member, said that the pandemic basically shut us down at a horrible time. That's not only true because it changed the subject and everybody was really fixated on the immediate public health crisis and economic crisis, but also because a lot of the conversations that lead to persuasion about redistricting have to happen face to face. They have to happen in a sort of a comfortable environment, and it wasn't necessarily going to happen on Zoom, and it wasn't going to happen by email. And so some of getting a very difficult bill to pass all the way through the process just became virtually impossible because the legislature was a building you couldn't be in, and people just weren't coming out of their houses. And the third thing that happened, I don't need to belabor, is that one of the champions of the bill on the Republican side in the House was arrested. Need I say more? So what do we do going forward? Well, I think we follow a similar strategy. We should assume that when the maps come out, there will be litigation. And the litigation will go on for some period of time, and we probably can't get the legislature to act on any kind of statutory or constitutional change until the litigation is in some fashion sorted out. But that shouldn't be 2029 or 2020. We can't wait that long. We need to get people on the record being in favor of reform. We need to make the case to both parties that you do not know who's going to be in charge in 2031. You need to take out an insurance policy against a catastrophic loss. Nobody wants to pay their insurance premium. It's a cost, but if you do it and you hope you never have to make the claim, but if you have to make the claim, you're covered. Similarly, if you're a Democrat or Republican in North Carolina in, let's say, 2025, you should be for redistricting reform to insure against a catastrophic loss that the other party is going to be in power in 2031 and that they will do something bad to you. And as long as both parties think that is a possible risk, this is a pretty good argument. We tried it. We tried it in 1999. Democrats said, we'll never lose the legislature again. They had just lost one chamber a few years earlier and got it back. They said, it's not going to happen again. We'll be in charge. In 2009, we made the same argument to Democrats. You might not be in charge after 2010. We basically got laughed out of the room, and they weren't in charge after 2010, so they wish they had taken out the insurance policy. In 2019 and 20, we made the argument to Republicans, you may not be in charge next year. And we almost got there, but for the reasons I talked about, didn't quite succeed. I think we can succeed this time because there's enough uncertainty. There's enough people who were said in the previous session. There are enough lawmakers right now who don't really expect to be in power in 2020 or be in office in 2021, that they can take an action that will not necessarily hurt their own political careers and might actually be a good way to cap off a political career by doing something bipartisan that strengthens their reputation. So I think we've got a real chance, but it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of work in the legislature and around the state, making the case for reform and explaining that reform is more about the standards and criteria that we use than it is necessarily about the particular form of line drawing. That's not unimportant, but the criteria, in my view, is the most important thing. Not just criteria, but specifying it and rank it in terms of priority so that it can be applied productively by either a commission or a legislative staff or some other process.
Caroline, you share John's optimism there.
Somewhat, yes. But I'd like to actually talk about two different things.
Sure.
One is something that I think is different at this moment where we are right now is the public awareness and public engagement on this issue. I think that members of the public are tuned into it more than they've ever been. And I think some of that is from media, some of it is from the work that academics and scientists and mathematicians and political scientists are doing. And I think conferences like this are important for that. So I think one piece is some public pressure that is building and hopefully will continue to build. Another is something that's been mentioned a few times, and I just want to take a moment here to talk about it. And that's some work that North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform is doing with local governments. As some of you may know, local governments that have electoral districts have to redistrict every 10 years, just like the legislature and just like congressional districts. And North Carolinians for Redistricting Reform has partnered with a group of lawyers and demographers to work with those local governments. Blake Esselstyn, who did a presentation earlier, is one of the main demographers. I'm one of the lawyers helping with that. And what we're doing is partnering with the local governments, helping them through the redistricting process, as long as they commit to an open and transparent process and no use of election data. And I think that that's important because it's sort of a ground up approach. If we can't get this at the legislature for our legislative and congressional seats, at least we can get it for city councils and county commissions, and people can see that in their own communities and they can participate and they can have a say and they can actually see the deliberations and see the conversations about the criteria and where the line should be drawn. So I think those two things are important. I don't know what may happen with reform. I'm hopeful, but I don't know.
Thank you. Chris, same question.
Yeah, I mean, first, I'm actually really excited about the work that they're doing in local governments. You know, I think when I talk to groups and classes about redistricting, right, orientation, right, I've got to move them away from Congress. First of all, it's more than just Congress. And for a while, it was I could successfully move them down to state legislatures, but getting them to think about local governments was tough. And so I think it's so critical. And I think it's funny, last time I just take local class right now, the last time I taught it, we were trying to talk to them about redistricting school boards. And they were like, they were asleep immediately. This time I'm like, school boards, you know, they're like kind of important, and they're, yes, like all of a sudden school boards matter for people, local government matters for people. I think this public awareness of how state and local governments matter is increasing at the same time that the public awareness about redistricting is increasing as well. So I'm really optimistic and happy about what we're seeing there. And I think actually that last panel made me feel somewhat better. I don't know, when I looked at the schedule, I thought, well, Tom Ross and Art Pope made me feel better about the odds of bipartisanship in North Carolina. And the answer is yes, at least when it comes to redistricting reform. I feel like the strategy the strategy for redistricting reform advocates is going to have to be to make sure that people are clear that they're attacking. They're trying to make sure that the people in power don't get to maintain power where they should, not to strip power from Republicans. Just like I think redistricting reform advocates previously needed to make sure that the conversation wasn't about stripping power from Democrats, right? This is about stripping power from the people with power, unless they get a fair vote. And I think sort of reorienting that conversation, the only sort of negative thoughts I have on it or cold water I have to throw on it is anytime I turn on Twitter. But other than that, I kind of feel like the odds that perhaps we can have some sort of bipartisan reform, especially if the time horizon, as John talked about very well, the time horizon is far enough. We're not challenging somebody's job next time, but perhaps we're challenging some other person's job 10 years from now. I think that's when we get reform on that. I think that's when we get reform on, frankly, a number of other issues that I think institutionally could improve our state.
Thank you, Chris. And I'd like to open to audience questions. And I think we have a microphone that Professor Hirschlag has in his hands that hopefully we can pass to anybody who'd like to raise them. We'll start with the in-person audience. If there are any questions, just raise your hand. And if not, we can sort of move back and forth between in-person and online.
I'm just wondering, you haven't mentioned.
Sorry, you might wait.
Let's go.
Thank you, Joel. Joel, fine.
I've been wondering if the impact of Trump and those who are his supporters will make a difference with this, and in what way? I mean, because that's a major change since the last time this happened, and it occurs to me that it might make a significant difference.
Who would like to take that one?
The rise of Trump and then the rise of the political movements associated with him has had an effect on a whole slate of issues. Hasn't really touched redistricting yet, but you can imagine ways that it could. My view about that is, you know, whatever you think about this political movement, and I have my own strong opinions about it, don't assume necessarily if you disagreed with their goals on a variety of issues, that they're also going to be against something like redistricting reform. For some of them, they think that the problem, I think to a fault, they believe the problem is the incumbent class of politicians. And anything that would get rid of all those rascals in office, they're sort of going to like. So a system, for example, that rigs it so that incumbents have a safe district that takes into consideration where incumbents live, I bet you anything that Trump motivated voters don't like that. And you could tap into that. And similarly, the notion that the public's will is being subverted by the political class is the kind of thing they say on a whole host of other issues, from trade to immigration to public spending or whatever. So my view about it is I'm not sure on this issue where they are. I haven't really been talking about it, but as someone who is obviously a failure, because I've been arguing for it, working for redistricting reform since the early 1990s, and we haven't gotten it yet. One of the lessons that I would say is leave no stone unturned. Look for support for this across the political spectrum in every possible way. And I think that we'll find more if we ask for it and seek it and then wield it to try to get reform to happen.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to that?
That's great.
Okay. Question right up front. No, sorry. Amanda first.
Hey, Amanda Soliday, I work at Duke. We heard a little from Professor Cooper about his takeaways from the public hearings. I was wondering if the other panelists have anything that they heard that they're really interested in. Thank you.
I haven't actually watched the public hearings. I've been very busy working with local governments. What I have heard some concerns about the accessibility and some questions about the public hearings, and it was supposed to be here and then we didn't get notice of it, some things like that. But I haven't actually followed it. I also know that there's only one public hearing scheduled for after maps are drawn, at least right now, and I think that's problematic. But that's all that I really know.
Well, I have watched a little bit. I've read coverage of organizations covering the public hearings and commenting on them online. And my impression is, and this was something Chris said earlier, a lot of people had very positive, very aspirational in a good sense, goals for redistricting reform. But there wasn't a whole lot of specificity that would let me know, just as an observer, whether they think that this is better than that. Should we have a strong commission system or a advisory commission with a staff-driven process? How, if you have a commission, how would it be composed? If we're talking about districts themselves, the communities where they are, as I said, that they want their communities to be treated fairly. They want to have the public's will determine elections and not the will of the incumbent politicians rigging the system. I agree with that. I'm not sure what else I can do with that, other than to recognize that this sense of, I want my community, usually geographic community, to be respected. I don't want the politicians to rig the system. And I want our elections, I don't want the outcomes of the elections to be radically different from the popular vote or something. Those are all valuable standards, and they're somewhat in tension, and we've got to think about how we're going to resolve that.
And I would just add that that is an excellent question to pose to our next and final session after this one, which will showcase the work of different redistricting reform advocacy organizations in North Carolina. We had another question right up front here, and then we'll move to online.
So I'm Kenny Walton, I'm a sophomore at Duke. So it's been a pretty cynical talk in my opinion. So the question I have is, what can grassroots activism look like when redistricting reform is pretty closed off to the courts with decisions like Baker v. Carshaw, or any of the recent ones in the 21st century that have pretty much given redistricting the green light? And it's closed off to the executive because of his very limited formal powers when it comes to combating gerrymandering. So what can grassroots activism look like outside of large interest groups or having limited access to politicians and lawmaking bodies through legal resources? What can that look like for an individual citizen?
I'll just say, I especially hope you stay for the next session, because I think you'll get that question answered. But if any of our current panelists would like to take a stab at that.
And I'll take a stab at it, but yeah, I'll be taking notes also in the next panel to hear what everybody has to say. I mean, there's some institutional barriers, but the good news in North Carolina is that the General Assembly members are drawing, this is the good news, bad news, right? The General Assembly is drawing the maps, but they're actually fairly accessible. I mean, when you compare members of our General Assembly to members of other legislative bodies across the country, I think ours are a little bit easier to access. I was a little disappointed that a lot of these hearings tend to be across college campuses, and I don't have numbers on this, but I was surprised just anecdotally at how rarely somebody would say, I'm a student at X college, even though it was on X campus. So I think taking those opportunities when they're there, I think lighting up the phones of members of the General Assembly, and I think being prepared, which I think you'll be after the next panel, but hopefully the last couple of days too, to be able to answer those specific questions. So if you talk to somebody who tends to be a little more resistant, you say, I want a fair process. And I think John's point's a good one. What do you mean by a fair process? And I think being able to come with those facts ready and those retorts ready, and then take advantage of the access you do have. I think you've got more power of access than people tend to realize if you take advantage of it. Look, most people in the state can't identify their state legislature. I asked a class of students who the North Carolina Speaker of the House was. First day of class, 0 out of 30. Could tell 2 of them was Madison Copeland, by the way. But that's true story. If you have that knowledge, if you know who to contact, I think you're going to have a leg up in trying to affect this process.
I'll also say that even if you can't make the in-person public hearings, the online portal for public comments is still open, and we're going to be providing information about that portal to everybody who registered for this conference after the conference is over as well. So, should we go to an online question? I think we have a couple more from the audience, but let's start with an online.
Yeah, so Lee Mortimer asks, is the consensus that the best we can hope for is to end extreme gerrymandering, but that normal gerrymandering will go on?
Anybody want to associate themselves with the idea of normal gerrymandering?
Well, I understand the thrust of Lee's question, so I will answer yes. Because I think that we absolutely can police extreme gerrymandering. I also don't think we could perfectly eliminate all political influences on gerrymandering. So I'm somewhere in between. I think we can. I think reform's job is to reduce the degrees of freedom that line drawers have. You can't eliminate them because they're, I mean, as those of us who were listening to even just the session this morning with the mathematicians talking about how to run the algorithms, I mean, you're going to have a large number of maps, all of whom are within if you have a bell curve distribution, they're all sort of within the center of the bell, and choosing between them at a certain point becomes a question of, do you rank this priority over that priority? Do you rank the outcome in this part of the state more important than the outcome in that part of the state as far as keeping geographic entities together or something like that? So my view about this is we can make it a lot better, not just a little bit better, but I don't think we can ever eliminate partisan or other kinds of self-interested motivations entirely from the process. And I think that redistricting commissions illustrate that it can be an improvement, that it is not going to take politics completely out of the process, but it can limit it significantly, and that's good enough. That's in the realm of government, making things a lot better is really impressive. Because it's usually a little better or a lot worse.
Yeah, I'll just add that I'm not sure that we could ever reach a point where everybody agrees that the process that we have is good. I think we can get most people to agree that extreme gerrymandering is bad, and that's progress.
Jen, did I see you had a question?
I did.
Yeah. Take the microphone.
Thanks. So this question is geared towards Caroline. So the last several rounds of court cases, it was pretty easy to prove intent. But since they are saying that they're not considering racial demographics and they're not considering party, is that a judicial out for them? If there ends up being gerrymandering, can courts look at the outcome, or do they need to show intent to get anything changed?
That's a great question. And actually, when the legislature redrew the legislative districts in 2017, they did not say that they were seeking partisan advantage or to preserve the partisan makeup. But the work of the mathematicians looking behind the curtain with the simulations showed that actually that's exactly what they were doing. So I think the intent is important because it shows what was predominant in the criteria, whether the criteria was stated out loud or whether it's what was behind the scenes actually driving the process. But to answer your question, whether they say it or not, there are ways to look behind the curtain. In the last litigation, we did that.
Back to online, and then we'll come back up front to it.
Yeah, there are a number of procedural questions in terms of the process to be expected coming up. So both from a constraint side, so to what degree will geography and previous rulings on things along these lines constrict the upcoming redistricting cycle? And also from a positive side, are there certain ideals that have to be met? Like what does it look like to draw a VRA district?
I'll take a little stab at maybe carve off part of it and then hand it over to y'all. I mean, I think first thing we need to do is to keep straight the difference between the General Assembly redraw and the congressional redraw, right? So we haven't talked too much yet about the sort of Stevenson clustering rule, I think was kind of mentioned briefly in our hopes conversation. But the General Assembly has a lot more room to move, I think, in terms of Congress, right? I mean, yes, there's a number of different solutions that produce very different outcomes with the clustering possibilities, but there are at least some more constraints, I think, on the General Assembly side. So for Congress, they don't have to follow these Stevenson rules. If you don't follow the stuff all the time, this is the rule that says that basically certain counties have to hang together. And so I think we need to distinguish between those two things. And I also think we should distinguish between the role of incumbency in the General Assembly redraws and in the congressional redraws, right? So a lot of folks don't know this, but for the General Assembly, you have to live in the district you represent. For Congress, you do not. So the role of incumbency protection, I think, can vary a little bit across which chamber or which body you're talking about. So I think it's not a consistent set of constraints necessarily that applies across both institutions. And I'll pass to the other table.
I don't know that I have a lot to add to that. I think it's really important to consider the varied nature of the two processes, even though the same people or the same institutions will be doing both the congressional and the legislative maps. Legislative maps do have different and I think somewhat more constricted avenues forward because of the county groupings. There are several cases, as Chris alluded to, where you can make a choice between this county grouping and that. There are some that are not chosen. If a county can be a district, it has to be. So the Stevenson criteria, in my view, which came out of litigation, did improve the process somewhat, but it does you no favors within a big urban county like a Mecklenburg or a Lake, where of course it's not a question of protecting county lines. Now you have to look at some other kinds of criteria, which we do not have in the force of law yet.
Part of that question was about VRA districts, and all that I'll say on that is the legislature has said that they're not considering race, so I don't know how VRA districts can be recognized and protected when they're not looking at that.
Thank you. Did you have another question? We could bring the mic back over to you. No, you're good. Never need to apologize for it.
So I was fascinated by what Professor Cooper said about the president really, the executive having really no formal powers to affect gerrymandering. But one thing I'm curious about is their informal powers, especially the bully pulpit, like what the president says or the executive says or believes. That's what a lot of people will adopt, their beliefs. So how much has or can, what even is the governor's stance on gerrymandering? And even though it's incredibly difficult to quantify the effect that would have on the legislature, has that produced any changes or any promises or made even like the prospect of redistricting reform any more cynical?
I'll take a stab at it. I'm curious what John would have said on this too, because I'm sure he's got some thoughts on that. So, I mean, I think he's in a little, look, right now, I'm certain that he is for redistricting reform. I think the Republicans in the room or the virtual room will certainly say, well, of course it is, because the Republicans are in charge of the process, right? So I think he's in a bit of a tough position. Yes, he's going to advocate for redistricting reform. Is he going to be accused quickly of thinking about his own partisan goals? Yes, clearly he will. So I don't know, just because we happen to have split control, I don't know how much his bully pulpit really works. I mean, to me, the bully pulpits that can work, frankly, are people like Art Pope. I think are people like John Hood. I think are people like Chuck McGrady. People who, at least the party they tend to be associated with, happens to be the party that is in power, will benefit from this process. And I think if we're going to drive towards redistricting reform, whoever your General Assembly member is, if they're a Democrat, I'm not much of a betting person, but I would bet you that they're for it right now. If you've got a Republican who is willing to listen to this conversation, I think that's where real partisan change happens. And I just don't think Will Cooper is in that place right now. But I'd love to hear John's take on that. Caroline's too.
Well, some of us have been around long enough to remember what North Carolina politics and legislation was like before the governor had any veto.
Right.
And the answer is the governor still mattered. And what the governor said sometimes had a decisive and often had a helpful effect on legislation that was passed. If the governor didn't like it, he didn't have a veto, but sometimes that was the end of the bill. So that you're right, there is some institutional powers other than the veto that governors in North Carolina used to use and could still use, and might, and like Roy Cooper could certainly use them. But I would go further than that. Remember that if we're talking in 2024, and Cooper's still in office, if we're talking about 2025, we don't know who the governor's going to be, and that opens up a different set of possibilities. But let's say we were in 2024, he's still the governor, and there is a real legislative effort to pass some sort of a bill. I'm here to tell you that there will not be one bill. There will be 2 bills or 3 bills or 7 bills. And some of the bills will have lots of Democratic support and a few Republicans, but not enough to pass. And some will have some, but not overwhelming Democratic support, and a lot more Republican support, but not quite enough to pass. And in particular, if the standard is 3/5, which is the standard to put something on the ballot, then a bipartisan coalition is essential. And Governor Cooper, in that scenario, let's assume the Republicans are still in power in the legislature in both chambers in 2024, which we also don't know. But imagine that that's true. Cooper could end up having a decisive role and say, this bill is better than this bill. I really think my fellow Democrats ought to support this bill. Democrats and Republicans are part of this story. The leadership in the legislature, minority and majority, were part of the conversation. We got close 2 years ago, and it will inevitably be involved in the passage of any bill, because it will have to be bipartisan coalition, where somebody is going to be voting out of step with many of his or her other members of her party and needs some support. And a governor's support is not nothing.
So I want to just close by asking each of our panelists to address the same question, because one thing that struck me about this whole discussion, both now and throughout the conference, is that multiple speakers have acknowledged that the last decade has been a roller coaster for redistricting and redistricting litigation. And it feels like right now that we're ticking up that hill of the roller coaster yet again, and that we all know it's coming, and yet there's nothing we can do about it because we're in the car, right? And so this is actually kind of a response to our friend's earlier comment here about the pessimism or the cynicism surrounding this issue. But I want you to look back to a decade ago and tell me one thing you feel less good about, but also tell me one thing that makes you more optimistic about the future on this issue. And we'll just go across here.
So I think let's see here. So what makes me feel more negative, I'll start with that, which is easier, is the way, I think Dave Lawson talked about this yesterday, the way that voting patterns are so much more predictable and in lockstep, right? So when I read media profiles of redistricting, sometimes they'll say, wow, the computers have changed at all, and they have, and I think on the detection side, they absolutely have, mathematicians. But I'm not convinced that on the map drawer side, that's been what's really mattered. I think what's mattered is the fact that it is so much more predictable, right? And we strip partisan data out, but the fact that we know how each precinct, every legislator knows how the precincts are going to vote. And so that part really worries me, right? We're more in lockstep, we're more sorted. I mean, if you think about, last time we did this, 10 years ago, even things that we take as gospel now, urban areas are blue, rural areas are red, right? Well, in 2000, Mecklenburg County and Buncombe County both voted for the Republican candidate for president in North Carolina. I mean, it was a very different world in 2000, so 2010 wasn't that far from there. But that part worries me, just that it's easier to gerrymander without information. I mean, heck, we could probably take a tour around Durham, and you could probably tell me based on the beer people are drinking what you're likely to vote, right? Like, it's just easier culturally, it's easier in every way. We just have, less split ticket voting and everything else. What's positive to me is that people are paying attention to that. I found an article that Jim Morrill had written, the last round of redistricting from a Mecklenburg County meeting, and I think he said there were 14 people present. So every one of these hearings had, maybe they could have been better, but they certainly didn't have 14 people, right?
people are paying attention now in a way that they just did not 10 years ago, and certainly did not 20 years ago. And I think that is something I'm optimistic about. My pessimistic take is that I am less convinced today than I was 10 years ago that the application of the Voting Rights Act is predictable, that lawmakers actually know whether they'll be in compliance or not. And I think that's an essential part of getting this whole process over the finish line, and that's challenging. On the positive side, though, we now have both Republicans and Democrats who have been in the majority, and I'm talking about leaders who have been in the majority and had their map struck down. So we have leaders, not just members, they're important, of course, but the leaders of the caucuses know what it is like to have their map struck down. I think that they don't want to have their map struck down. And that helps to get us, in my view, towards the finish line, because again, no redistricting reform is going to be perfect. But one of the things you can sell a self-interested politician on is the argument I made earlier about take out an insurance policy against a catastrophic loss. And the other one that you can sell a self-interested politician or political party about is, wouldn't you like to have the confidence that the districts you draw will stick around for a while? Because they really like that idea that they could predict it. And I think that's helpful. So I'm generally optimistic. I'm still not sure we know yet, or people have agreement yet about what VRA districts. And in fact, since there's going to be no racial data use, supposedly, that makes this an even more cloudy question.
So first, I want to say the roller coaster ride has been really fun. Fun and interesting. But the positive is that we made a lot of progress through that litigation. And I think we like to complain about litigation, but we shouldn't forget that progress is made and rules are changed and people learn from litigation. I would say my pessimist side is that the federal courts are closed to partisan gerrymandering. I think that is a real setback for reform. But I'm going to look on the positive side and remember the courage of the 3 state judges who looked at the North Carolina Constitution with a close eye and said that, yes, the Constitution protects free elections, and when the results are rigged from the get-go, that's not a free election.
Thank you, and want to thank all of our panelists as well as our audience here and online, especially online for bearing with my muffled microphone. Before we give a round of applause, just a brief programming announcement. We're going to go ahead and move pretty quickly towards our final panel without much of a break, so I strongly encourage you to stick around, those of you here and online. Those of you here will be rewarded for your commitment. We'll have a small grab-and-go reception downstairs outside in the Sanford lawn with what I understand to be some sugar. Unfortunately, no alcohol consistent with current guidelines, but plenty of sugar to take with you. And so stick around for another session and grab something on your way out. With that, I'd like to ask you to thank our panelists on this interesting discussion.